Hi everyone, welcome to today's Connect and Learn webinar. It's great to have everybody on board today. Before we get into the webinar, I'd just like to note that we're coming together from all over different parts of Victoria and in fact Australia probably. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands where we're presenting from today, as well as the nations upon which every one of you in webinar land are watching from. So collectively paying our respects to all Aboriginal elders past, present and emerging, and obviously extending that respect to all First Nations people here in Australia and overseas as well. So today's webinar is part of the Connect and Learn series designed to support AOD clinicians throughout regional and metropolitan Victoria. It's hosted by Turning Point and funded by the Department of Health and Human Services Victoria. My name's Rita. I'm facilitating today's webinar. The format for today is probably a little bit different to previous Connect and Learn sessions. We're transmitting to you directly from the Turning Point training rooms rather than behind a desk in a studio. So we do ask that you turn off your cameras please and microphones just to ensure the best streaming experience we can, and if you do forget, our admin may turn them off for you. We do still want the webinar to be as interactive as possible, so really do encourage you to use the chat function on your screen to post any questions, comments or feedback that you might have throughout the session. And part of my role is going to be to collate them as they come up, and there'll obviously be time at the end for our presenter Naomi to respond to any questions accordingly. So without any further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce you to our presenter, Dr Naomi Crafti, who will be talking to us today about how to keep up to date with knowledge and qualifications for the alcohol and other drugs sector, specifically here in Victoria. Naomi's been the Workforce Development Manager here at Turning Point for the last 8 years. Previously, she taught psychology at Swinburne and in fact taught me in my undergraduate degree about 15 years ago, and also more recently in the Masters of Addictive Behaviours with Monash University. So here we are again in a different context. While recently stepping back into an academic and teaching role, Naomi's parting gift or gesture to us here in Workforce Development is to attempt to summarise simply what she's learnt in her time here with us about the educational requirements of the AOD workforce in Victoria. So she hopes, as do I, that the webinar will be an opportunity for both current and future AOD workers to get the facts about tertiary qualifications in Victoria and encourage a culture of lifelong learning in the sector. So I'm going to hand over to Naomi for the next 40 minutes or so, and we'll be back at the end for questions.
Thank you, Rita, and good afternoon, everybody, and lovely to be with you for the final Connect and Learn webinar for 2020, which is obviously a very memorable year for everybody. The title of the webinar today, I work in the AOD sector, what do I need to know and how can I keep up to date, is almost sort of verbatim a summary of the type of emails that I would get regularly as Manager of Workforce Development at Turning Point. So I would get these emails asking me, you know, what sort of qualifications do I need to work in the sector? And I'd always sort of sit back and sigh to myself when I got these emails, because I'd think, oh, I wonder if this person has almost an hour for me to have a chat to them about this, and do I want to go through this individually, person by person, because it's quite a complicated area and quite a complicated question to answer in a short period of time. So I thought that it was quite appropriate as I step out of the managing area at Turning Point to provide this webinar, which is really an answer to this question in summary for people who are interested in working in the sector and hopefully save the future manager from having to answer the same question over and over again. So I'd also just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land on which we stand and pay my respects to their elders and the elders of other Aboriginal communities that may be watching this presentation. So what am I going to talk about? What are the contents of this webinar? Well, I'm going to start by looking at the range of qualifications, personal characteristics and life experience that one might need to work in the AOD sector. I'm going to talk a little bit about the vocational education sector and the Victorian minimum qualification strategy and what that means, and what that means for people who want to work in the AOD sector in Victoria. I'm going to talk about degrees and professional training, so general degrees, AOD specialist postgraduate qualifications and PhDs, and why someone might do those or choose to do those. And then lastly, I'm going to look at professional development courses and micro-credentialing and what that means and how that contributes to lifelong learning in the AOD sector. So this is a picture of me on the left of the screen with my colleagues Phoebe and Sheridan. And I've mentioned there that in a largely unregulated industry, there are many pathways to success. So one of the things that I love about the AOD sector is the fact that it's multidisciplinary, and it means that all my colleagues and all the people that I work with here at Turning Point and that I've met across the sector have come into the sector from lots of different directions and along many different pathways of qualification and experience. And I think that that's a real strength of the AOD sector, and quite different from my background in psychology, where not only are psychology degrees themselves highly regulated, so everybody who has a psychology degree learns exactly the same thing, not only in Victoria and Australia, but across the world pretty much. But also the profession itself is very highly regulated. And so pretty much everyone who works as a psychologist or in other professions like social work, nursing, medicine, law, have had very similar journeys to getting to their professional careers. But in the AOD sector, we don't have that. And that, as I said, I think is one of the strengths of the sector, and it makes it very exciting. But it also makes it very confusing to know exactly what it is that one should do to be successful as an AOD worker, and how one gets to working in the sector. So as I said, my background is psychology, and I've worked mainly in education and had an academic career. My colleague Phoebe has a nursing background and has done postgraduate studies in AOD and mental health, and worked for many years in a clinical role, and so she's bringing that clinical experience to the work that she does. And Sheridan, on the right-hand side of the picture, she has also a psychology degree, but has worked in community development advocacy, working primarily in the areas of family violence and working in women's crisis settings. So she brings quite a different perspective to her work in drug and alcohol as well. So we all have different journeys, and that's true of pretty much everybody here at Turning Point. So when a person decides that they want to work in the drug and alcohol sector, what are some of the things that you might consider, both in deciding whether or not to work in the sector and to employ people in the sector? Well, again, sort of following through this analogy of the recipe, or as I call it perhaps inappropriately, a cocktail of characteristics, there's a whole range of things that you have to consider if you're going to work in the sector or employ somebody in the sector. And that includes what are their relevant higher education qualifications, what sort of counselling skills and clinical experience might they have, personal qualities, what's their personal politic, and alcohol and other drug qualifications. And I'm going to talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. So starting with personal qualities, the list that I've got here, I mean, it could be a very long list, and this is not meant to be a definitive list of all the personal qualities that a person might have to work in the sector. And in fact, we could spend the next few days talking about the personal qualities that one needs to work in the AOD sector, and we might all have different ideas about that. But it's certainly true that particular types of people are attracted to the sector, and particular types of people might consider themselves not suitable for working in the sector. So these sort of personal qualities are the things that we bring to our work that enable us to do our job successfully. An interesting question that I always like to ponder about personal qualities are, can you learn these qualities, or are they something that we're born with? And while I don't think we have good empirical evidence to suggest the answer to that question, I think most of us would probably agree that it's likely to be somewhere in between, that people are born with particular types of qualities that might then be tuned or enhanced because of the work that they do in a particular type of area. And that's probably true of people who work in the drug and alcohol sector. As well as our personal qualities, our innate personal qualities, people have both a clinical and lived experience. Again, I think we could have a whole webinar about the topic of lived experience and the importance of lived experience in both the drug and alcohol and mental health sectors. One of the things that I like to say to people is that we all have a lived experience, that is, we have all lived. And our lived experience, whether it's specifically in the alcohol and drug area or with loved ones with drug and alcohol problems or with mental health issues, our lived experience is all likely to be different, and there's no such thing as a lived experience. So sometimes people talk about people with a lived experience again as if they were a homogeneous group, which of course they're not. So clinical and lived experience is something that we develop over a lifetime. And so we come into the workforce with a certain amount of that experience and then develop those skills and that experience over a lifetime. And part of developing our clinical and lived experience is paying attention to it, reflective practice, supervision and other things that I'm going to talk about a little bit later in this presentation, and about really taking advantage of that clinical and lived experience to make it helpful to other people and to enhance our ability to do our jobs successfully. So I think maybe just at this point I might recommend to people that if you're going for a job interview or if you're going to write your CV, I think you should really spend a little bit of time thinking about how your clinical experience, that is your experience with other people, with mental health or drug and alcohol problems or other clinical issues, and your lived experience helps you in the work that you do, and you should use that as a sort of selling point, if you like, to why you are a good person to work to do the job that you're applying to do or to do to work in the sector. And then when I talk about personal politic, certainly I'm differentiating personal politic from partisan politics. So it's certainly not true that you have to vote for a particular political party to work in the sector. But people who work in the drug and alcohol sector, certainly within Australia, tend to share a set of values and attitudes that create a particular culture that enhances the experience for people who use alcohol and other drugs. And so understanding whether or not you fit into that culture obviously makes a big difference to understanding whether or not this is work that is going to be something that you enjoy and something that's going to be useful for your clients and for people that you come across in your work in the alcohol and other drug area. So let's talk a little bit about what it means to have a relevant higher education qualification. So this particular graph comes from a recent workforce development survey that some of you might have participated in. So it was the NCETA survey that was done the end of 2019. It's an Australian-wide survey, so 1,366 participants in the AOD sector across Australia contributed to this survey. And the question that was asked here is, what is the highest general qualification that you have obtained? So by general qualification, we're meaning not a specific drug and alcohol qualification. And I may be wrong, I'm willing to accept that I may be wrong, but in my opinion there's a problem with this graph. So this graph is taken directly from the data provided by NCETA. But if you look down the list of qualifications, I think the graduate certificate / diploma should come after undergraduate degree. So this is a list of qualifications that people have done, that people have post-primary school, and their highest level of qualification post-primary school. And a lot of people get confused, and perhaps the person who put this graph together was confused about the difference between a certificate 4 and a graduate certificate. So in my world, a graduate certificate or a graduate diploma is something that comes after an undergraduate degree or a bachelor's degree. But regardless of that, let's assume that the data is accurate. You can see that from this survey, approximately 26%, or just over a quarter of the survey participants do not have a degree. And so the argument being that approximately a quarter of people who work in the drug and alcohol sector or who participated in the survey across Australia don't have a degree, which is an interesting statistic, I think. I think that is far higher than the Victorian statistic, and there might be a reason for that I'll be talking about a little bit later because of our minimum qualification strategy. But it also reflects, I guess, the fact that the drug and alcohol sector was initially born from people who came into working in the sector with a lived experience rather than a higher education qualification. And we still have a lot of people working in the sector who don't necessarily have professional qualifications, but have been working in the sector for a while because of their lived experience and their contribution to the sector from lived experience. So about 26% don't have a degree, but also approximately 42% of people do have postgraduate qualifications, and I'm including in that the people in that list with a graduate certificate or graduate diploma. So nearly half the people who participated in the survey have either a bachelor's degree or higher. And so I think it's probably important at this stage to make the point that even though this is an unregulated area of work, so there's no specific requirement that people who work in the drug and alcohol sector have a degree or that they have any particular type of qualification. We are seeing, certainly in the time that I've worked in the sector and even greater over the sort of last 20 or 30 years that Turning Point has been providing education in this area, that the number of people with degrees and postgraduate degrees is increasing in the sector. And what does that mean for you as somebody who wants to work in the sector? Well, it does mean that even though nobody says you have to have a degree to work in the drug and alcohol sector, if you go for a job in the sector and you don't have a degree, it's very likely that you're going to be competing against other people applying for that job who do have higher education qualifications. So this makes it quite problematic because there are courses that we are delivering to the general public or to prospective students where we're saying you're going to learn how to work in the drug and alcohol sector if you do this course, but the truth is that they're going to find it very hard with those courses to get jobs in the sector because there are people with higher qualifications who are going to be applying for the same jobs. And this is where it's different from psychology, social work, nursing, some of the other professions that I've been talking about previously, where you know the level of qualification that you need to have to do a particular job, and you know that the other people applying for jobs at that particular level are going to have similar qualifications to you. And maybe this is something we can have a bit of a conversation about a bit later if any of you want to discuss this any further. So as part of this survey, NCETA also asked specifically about AOD qualifications. So the question was, what is the highest AOD related qualification that you have obtained? And you can see that again, they have put graduate certificate diploma before undergraduate degree, where I think it should probably go afterwards. So what this data tells us, well, it's got some really interesting, I think there's some really interesting data in there that we can unpack. I should just mention, so the light grey bars are everybody who works in the sector who has responded to this particular survey. So that was a total of 1,345 participants. And then the turquoisey blue bars are people who work in client service roles, so directly with clients. And of those 1,345, there were 961 in those roles. So what I think is really interesting about this data is that about 20% of people in client service roles have specialised AOD qualifications at a bachelor level or above. So about 1 in 5 of people who work with clients in the sector have either a bachelor's degree or higher qualifications, specifically in AOD. So they've done qualifications that have AOD generally in the title, or where AOD is a really core element in that particular area of study. So, and that 20%, I think, we don't have really good long-term data about that, but I think that number of people who have specific drug and alcohol qualifications at a postgraduate level certainly is growing. And the reason that I can say that is because the number of courses that are available for people at either a bachelor's level or above is increasing and has increased over the last 10 to 20 years. So that the demand for people to have specialist knowledge in that area is definitely increasing. But the other statistic that I think is really interesting in this data is that there's still a really large percentage of people, roughly a third of the sector, who have either no qualifications or have just done short courses in drug and alcohol work. And a question that I'm not going to be able to answer today, but maybe just will pose for you to think about, is this holding the profession back? Is the fact that we have a relatively large percentage of the workforce who don't have formal qualifications in drug and alcohol working in the drug and alcohol sector, is that to our detriment and to our clients' detriment? Again, I'm sure that there will be people who have lots of different opinions about this, but it wouldn't be true in other similar roles, people who work in mental health, people who work in social work, that you would expect to have such a high proportion of people who don't have specific knowledge in the field of work in which they're working. So why is this important? Why is it important to know what level of qualifications people have and what specific drug and alcohol qualifications they have? Well, it all has something to do with this thing called AQF levels. And again, if I had to sort of list one of the frequently asked questions that I got as Manager of Workforce Development over the last 8 years. It was, look, I have a Certificate 4 in AOD, why do I need to do any studies, or what's the difference between a Certificate 4 and a graduate certificate. I've even had people who were studying to do a graduate certificate and didn't realise that it was different from a Certificate 4. So they were actually, if you like, doing a course but didn't know at what level they were studying. So it is rather a complicated system, and if you don't work in the education system, I can understand why you would find it complicated. But the important point, I think, for us to think about is that the AQF stands for Australian Qualification Framework, and to understand that the levels of a course, or the AQF level that a particular qualification sits in, determines at what types of skills and styles of learning are focused on at that particular level. So I was trying to think of a good analogy to explain this to people overnight. And one of the analogies that I came up with, it mightn't be precise, but is, if you imagine that you went to school and you studied mathematics, if you were in prep or grade 1 and you were studying mathematics, and then you got to grade 6 and you were still studying mathematics, and you walked up to the teacher and said, look, I already know maths, I've been studying it for the last 6 years, I don't need to do it anymore. The teacher would probably explain to you that what you learn in grade 1 is very different from what you learn in grade 6, and perhaps more importantly is that what you learn in grade 6 builds on what you've been learning from prep or even kindergarten perhaps through to grade 6. So these levels build on one another, and so you need to learn sometimes the earlier information in order to be able to take on and develop the higher level information. So some people have this idea that all tertiary qualifications are the same, and if I have a Certificate 3, for example, why would I need to do any further study? If I have a Certificate 4 in AOD, I know everything there is to know about AOD, and I don't need to have any further qualifications. And that's true in terms of the fact that the sector is not regulated, and so there's no specific requirement that you have qualifications at a particular AQF level in order to work in the sector. But it's certainly also true that what you learn at level 5, 6, 7, 8, etc. is going to be quite different from what you learn at some of the other levels. So just to explain a little bit further about what happens at the various levels, some of you have probably heard of the concept of Bloom's taxonomy. So the different AQF levels are related to the different levels in Bloom's taxonomy. So for example, a Cert 4 might be at the level of applying information, so it's where we learn about we get particular knowledge that can be then applied in the real world to the work that we do in drug and alcohol. When you do a bachelor's degree, you'll know that there's a lot of conversation at the moment about arts degrees and various types of undergraduate degrees, and the generic skills that people learn when they do those degrees. So they learn to critically analyse information, or to be able to evaluate what's going on. So those skills of critical analysis often are honed at the bachelor level. And then at a postgraduate level, that's where you might learn your research skills, how to do a research project, all the statistics and the background information that's important to be able to both read the academic literature and understand it, but also to do your own research. And I guess at the apex of this particular diagram we have creating, and so when a person completes a PhD, the general criteria for a PhD and for completing a PhD is the idea that a person is creating new knowledge. So PhD is about developing knowledge and creating knowledge in an area that hasn't been created before, or building on creating new knowledge in an area where you're building on information that has been developed previously. So Bloom's taxonomy is related very much to those AQF levels that I was talking about. So when you study at different areas, at different levels of higher education qualification, you are focusing on particular skills that work to that particular level. And I think the pyramid as a sort of metaphor for that is really important, because you need to build on some of those I don't like to use the word lower level skills, but structural foundation skills. You need to build on those in order to sort of move up through the pyramid. So now we come to talking about the Victorian minimum qualification strategy. So this was information, of course, that was very new for me when I started at Turning Point in 2012. But by that stage, the Victorian minimum qualification strategy had already been around for about 6 years. It was developed by the Brax government, what was then, I think, the Department of Health in the Brax government. And it's very unique to Victoria. So Victoria is the only state in Australia, as far as I'm aware, that has gone some way to saying, well, if you work in the AOD sector, we do really want people to know something about AOD, about alcohol and other drugs. So as I said, it's a completely unregulated area as far as education requirements are concerned. So elsewhere in Australia, there's no guidelines as to what one requires in order to work in the sector. But the Victorian minimum qualification strategy did at least make some attempt to get a minimum qualification that the Department of Health thinks is important for people who work in the sector. So the qualification strategy says that new workers entering the sector without relevant qualifications, so that is where they don't have any higher education qualifications of relevance to the area, must obtain a specialist qualification in alcohol and other drugs or addiction at the Cert 4 level, and I have added the or higher because that is not in the qualification strategy, and I think it's a very important omission. Because so often when you look at job ads in the sector, they say in order to work in the sector, you need to have a Cert 4 in alcohol and other drugs. And of course, you don't have to have that Cert 4 if you have a higher qualification. And I will talk a little bit more about that in a moment. To be eligible to work in the alcohol and drug service funded by the department. So the department, of course, can't mandate what people do in privately funded services, but in services that they fund, they require people to have that qualification. Now, it's not policed as far as I can tell, and the majority of people who work in the sector gain their alcohol and other drug specialist qualifications once they start working in the sector, not necessarily beforehand. But certainly with this minimum qualification strategy, we've seen the number of people in Victoria who have these relevant qualifications increase over time. Then the second part of the minimum qualification strategy says, so the first part refers to people who don't have any other relevant qualifications, but the second part says, new workers entering the sector who have a health, social or behavioural science tertiary qualification, and I've added or cognate discipline, And I'll tell you what those are in a moment, because I think back in 2006 when they came up with this minimum qualification strategy, life was a lot simpler, and all degrees were fitted under the category of either health, social or behavioural science. But nowadays we have so many different names for different types of qualifications, it's not always clear what that means. So people who have these tertiary qualifications, you don't need to go back and do a Cert 4, a complete Cert 4 in AOD. It's just recommended that you complete the 4 core induction competencies or a specialist qualification in alcohol and other drugs at Cert 4 level or higher. So in other words, many of you would have heard about the 4 AOD competencies or the AOD skill set. If you already have a degree in an area that's sort of relevant to working in the AOD sector or mental health, then you don't need to go back and do a complete Cert 4, but you need to at least do the AOD skill set or complete a higher qualification, specifically in drug and alcohol. And the last part of the minimum qualification strategy says that if a worker has an undergraduate degree, completing a specialised graduate certificate or graduate diploma, or I could add masters in alcohol and other drug studies, meets and exceeds the minimum qualification. So again, a lot of people who put in their job ads that you need to do the 4 AOD competencies in order to work in the sector do not take into consideration the fact that there are many people who have done specialised qualifications at a postgraduate level and therefore already exceed the minimum qualification. So just to specify a little bit further what is meant by cognate discipline. So there's a whole range of areas that people might have tertiary qualifications in that fit into that sort of broad health, behavioural science category. And this is a bigger list, but in no way a complete list of all the things that might fit under the heading of cognate discipline. And I guess a way of thinking about this is, have I learnt as part of this higher education qualification the basic generic skills that one requires to work in the sector without the specific drug and alcohol knowledge? And that specific drug and alcohol knowledge is something that is often picked up at a later date. So the minimum qualification strategy in Victoria recommends that if you have a degree in a cognate discipline, in one of the areas that we've specified, the first step to developing qualifications in drug and alcohol is to complete the AOD skill set. And the 4 units of competency that make up the AOD skill set are shown in this particular slide. If any of you want further information about these competencies, you can Google either the code or the name of the competency into the website training.gov.au, and you get very detailed information about what is involved in each of these competencies. The AOD skill set is taught at both TAFEs and at industry-based RTOs. So at Turning Point, we like to think that industry-based RTOs are a better place to learn about working in the drug and alcohol sector, because the people who teach in industry-based RTOs, and that includes Regen and the Odyssey Institute and a number of other RTOs in Victoria, The people who teach in those environments are people with experience of working in the AOD sector and are embedded in services that are part of the AOD sector. And so that's what we call industry-based learning. But the content is equivalent to the content that is taught in TAFE institutions as well. So people often sort of sit back at this stage. They've decided to work in the sector, or they've either got a job in the sector or would like to look for a job in the AOD sector, and think to themselves, what should I do? Should I do a vet level qualification? Should I complete the AOD skill set, or should I complete a higher education qualification at either a bachelor degree or above? And you can see there that I've mentioned the AQF levels. And I think the important thing to consider out of all this is down the bottom. You don't need to make a choice to do one or the other. It could be that you choose to do the vet level qualification to provide you with the foundation knowledge that you need to work in the sector, and that you go on to do further study at a bachelor or higher postgraduate level as something that you do later on in your career when you are more established in the sector and when you have more experience of working in the sector. So I put there some sort of pros and cons for people to think in making that decision. So the AOD skill set is more skill or competency based. That's obviously where it sits. So you're learning how to do a whole range of tasks in the sector. It's taught either online or face-to-face or some sort of hybrid of the two. This year has been an interesting year as far as online learning is concerned. Each unit, or in the AOD skill set, takes roughly 3 to 4 days to complete, plus assessment tasks or work outside of classroom-based activities. The tasks are generally quite applied. The assessment is not graded. It's either competent or not competent. And the skill set is provided free for DHHS funded workers. So they're just some of the sort of characteristics of that qualification. If you're going to do qualifications at higher education, then you're talking about higher AQF levels. So it's perhaps more theoretical. There's greater depth of understanding of the material. To complete the higher education qualifications usually requires greater academic skills, but not necessarily greater technical skills. So it's interesting, some people seem to be better at one or the other. Doing qualifications at postgraduate level can lead to research, policy, management careers, so different areas of work to clinical work. But as we all know, it's very expensive to do higher education study at the moment. So you need to think very carefully about, is this the right thing for me? It's not something that you would necessarily do right at the beginning of your career, because you may not know long term whether this is something that you're going to be continuing on into the future. But that expense may be offset because it may lead to higher paying jobs. Whole other webinar again about the sector and the fact that it's not regulated, and we don't necessarily tie particular levels of qualification to particular types of jobs. So I've got a number of slides now that just briefly run through the content of the Turning Point graduate courses. There are 4 courses that we are running now from 2021. I haven't got time today, nor do I think all of you would be interested in a lot of detail about these courses. So just to let you know that we had an information night with Monash about a month ago, I think, a month or 2 ago, and we recorded that information session, and it's on the Turning Point website under Higher Education. So for those of you who'd like a bit more information about these courses, you can find it there. But from next year, we have 3 courses in the area of addictive behaviours: a graduate certificate, which is 1 year part-time, a graduate diploma, which is 2 years part-time, and a Master of Addictive Behaviours, which is either 2 or 3 years, depending on prior levels of qualification and experience. And new for 2021, which is really exciting, is a Graduate Certificate of Telehealth, which is not AOD specific, but is focusing on obviously a really important element of mental health and general health provision that is done either by phone, video conferencing, email, online, etc. So this is just, all these slides are available as part of that information evening webinar that I told you about that's online, but there's just a slide there that talks a little bit about the sort of an overview. I'd like to say that if you completed the Master of Addictive Behaviours, which is for most people 3 years part-time, that you will know everything there is to know about addiction, but of course that's not true. And so it's a massive area. You will know an awful lot about the area of addiction and addictive behaviours if you complete the Master of Addictive Behaviours, but of course there's always more to learn and always new information being generated. So this slide just explains the difference between the graduate certificate, the graduate diploma and the master degree. It's possible now for people to enrol in any of those qualifications independently. And if you complete the master, then you do a combination. So that they follow from one another in the sense that the master, they're not completely separate degrees. Everyone who does either the graduate diploma or anyone who does any of those courses does the same first year courses, and then some people graduate with a graduate certificate. They go on to do similar second year and so on. I'll let you look at the detail in your own time. So these are the subjects that are taught as part of the graduate certificate or in the first year of the graduate diploma and masters. Then in the second year of the course, there are a further 2 units that are taught. And then we have a number of electives that are taught at in the third year as part of the master's degree. Or a person can choose the research stream where they get an opportunity to conduct a major research project, generally on a topic of their choice, or they might be involved in a research project that's already taking place here at Turning Point. The Graduate Certificate of Telehealth is a course that teaches people the fundamentals of telehealth services. It might surprise some of you to know that there is actually a very extensive literature in this area, and it's a very well-established area, so it's not just something that started in March 2020. Learning to work primarily from a virtual perspective using either telephone or other online services is a very specific discipline area. So there's just a little bit more about the features of the Certificate of Telehealth, graduate certificate, but I'm certainly happy to talk to people outside of today and give you a bit more information about this course, or you can find it in the information session that is recorded on the Turning Point website. So these are just some of the areas that are covered. So the Graduate Certificate of Telehealth is a 1-year part-time course. There are 4 6-week units that are taught as part of the course, and there's just some examples of the topics that are covered in this particular course. So just lastly, before we finish and take questions, I'd just like to briefly talk a little bit about professional development and micro-credentialing. So I've already said that you can't learn everything there is to learn in one course at whatever level that might be. And so throughout a person's career, we would always recommend that people engage in professional development activities. And professional development is generally considered non-accredited. So by that we mean that if you participate in a professional development workshop or series of workshops, you generally don't do any assessment, and there's no way of, you could just be sitting there on your phone or looking out the window or whatever it might be. So there's no way of actually assessing whether or not a person has learnt anything by doing that particular course. So it's an opportunity to learn new skills, but people gain a certificate of attendance, which means that you are physically there or you attended online, but it's not considered to be a recognised qualification because it's not assessed. Micro-credentialing, on the other hand, is a sort of fairly new term that refers to the fact that people, and certainly Monash University and other universities are starting to do that, the opportunity for people to do little bite-size qualifications that could be put together into, for example, a graduate certificate or a graduate diploma down the track once they've gathered enough credit points for it to be actually called a qualification. So I just like to suggest to people that they think that education and learning occurs every day, but if you need to pay attention to what it is that you're learning and structure it into your work life to make it beneficial for you. So I think I was quite surprised when I came to work in the drug and alcohol sector just how much literature there is in there. I mean, none of us would ever be able to keep up with the amount of new literature and research that's being done in this field. And so we tend to be very specialised and just focus on the literature in our own specialist area. So there's always new things to learn, there's always new information to develop. And so I'd like to recommend that rather than thinking about what do I need to know to start working in the AOD sector, thinking about how am I going to keep learning through my career in the AOD sector. So you might start doing a Cert 4 or diploma or perhaps a bachelor degree, and you would do that if you don't have a bachelor's degree in a health-related area, and that is at vocational education and training level. You might then go on later in your career when you've definitely decided that drug and alcohol is the area you want to work in to do a graduate certificate or master's. And then if you're really keen and want to create new knowledge and become specialised in a particular area of work, you might do a PhD. And if we think of that as being the formal qualification pathway for people who work in the sector, we can lay on top of that professional development in certain areas of particular interest that come up across your career, your own personal scholarship, reading and attending conferences and seminars and online webinars like the one you're attending today, reading journal articles, and of course supervision, which is a very important part of our professional development in the human services. So this is what a lifelong learning model might look like, and as I said, it's not regulated, but I think there's a lot of discussion in the sector about at what stage in your career you should be learning particular things or doing particular qualifications. So we'll take some questions.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Naomi, and to everyone for staying tuned. I think that was super informative. Sian, I think I said that, I hope I'm saying that right. Just wanted to point out that ACT have a qualification strategy. It looks a bit similar to ours, and New South Wales have a capability framework. So we've popped the links in the chat, and as we discuss through the chat, we can send you all the links to those after the webinar, along with the slides. Rob asked, is there a PhD of addictive behaviours? You sort of touched on it, but maybe you want to elaborate on maybe what the pathway is to study a PhD and why you might want to do that. We've got a couple of minutes.
Thank you, and thank you for the information about frameworks in other areas, because obviously that's not something that I'm familiar with in my role down here. PhDs, yes. So look, few people will tell you that, you know, one of the things that I've been pushing a number of people to do here at Turning Point is to do a PhD as part of their studies in drug and alcohol. As I said, it's a way of creating new knowledge, and it's also a way of establishing yourself as an expert in a particular area. So it's at the pointy end because you become very focused on a particular area or research question, and you spend somewhere between 3, 4 and 10 years of your life just focusing on that particular research area, but you certainly become an expert at it, and then there's demand for you to contribute to the body of knowledge in that particular area. So I would certainly recommend that. The pathway for doing a PhD is usually to do a postgraduate qualification where you learn the basic research skills. So that might be a graduate diploma or a master's degree. You get the basic research skills, and then you apply to your university to do a PhD, and you're usually partnered with a supervisor, a research supervisor, who is happy to take you on for supervision of that particular research area that you want to work in.
Thanks, Naomi. We'll try and squeeze a couple more in. I'm just mindful we've got another few minutes. Oh, they're all sliding in. Somebody has commented there seems to be a growing number of vet and higher education providers offering AOD courses. Any further tips for workers on choosing a provider? I'm just going to speak on your behalf and say, of course, we advocate that Turning Point runs great courses. But that being said, I think I'd come back to what Naomi said about industry-based education providers that understand the context and the specificities of the sector. So in Victoria, Regen, Turning Point, Odyssey and other organisations.
And I might just add, so I obviously would second that, that you need to think very carefully about why you're wanting to do that qualification and what you're looking for, and there can be a whole lot of variables that you might consider. Do I want to study online? Do I want to study face-to-face? Do I want to do study that has a sort of international focus, or one that's focused within Australia or regionally? I think the important thing there are a lot of providers out there. I'd be very careful about some of the less well-established, newer providers, private providers. Everybody who offers higher education courses needs to be registered with TEXA as a higher education provider, and they need to meet certain criteria in order to do that. And the other thing you need to do is your homework in terms of looking at the content, asking lots of questions, making sure that it's going to meet your needs. And perhaps talking to previous students is a good way of getting information as well. Most universities and higher education providers have information evenings or information sessions that you can attend to get information about those courses.
Perfect. It's a pretty good way to wrap up. We've got a few more questions coming through that have come through from people asking about nursing and mental health and AOD qualifications. We might have to leave it there because we're running out of time, but we can, when we send out the links that we mentioned in the chat and the slides, respond to some of those in a little bit of a Q&A. So keep an eye out on the email address that you registered to attend on. I'd like to thank... Or you can send directly to Turning Point, but we have saved the chat, so we can write up a little FAQ. But otherwise, you can definitely contact us through tp@turningpoint.org.au. Also, if you have other questions or queries, you can find out more on the Turning Point website, either the education and training website or the higher education page that Naomi mentioned, and there's contact details there to get in touch with us as well for all the courses. So thanks to Naomi for a very informative presentation today. Thank you to everyone out there for joining us and staying online. It's exciting to have had you. We look forward to being with you again for our next webinar, which won't be till 2021. So keep an eye out, obviously, on VADA e-News and all the usual channels. Have yourselves a safe and festive and probably very well-deserved break if you can squeeze one in at the end of the year. And we will see you again next time.